Right, so Benjamin Netanyahu may have Greek airspace at his disposal, but he doesn't have its ports anymore, and that's a much bigger problem for him than you might think. At Piraeus, one of the Mediterranean's largest container ship ports and a vital logistics hub for Israeli goods, dock workers have looked at 5 ships packed with military-grade steel for Israel's arms industry and said, "Forget it, sunshine, we're not touching that." While Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis signs billion-dollar defence deals with Israeli weapons manufacturers and parrots diplomatic platitudes about humanitarian concern, the men and women hauling containers in Europe's busiest Mediterranean port have taken Greece's foreign policy into their own hands. Where ports are so often just thought of as waystations of global trade, they're now becoming moral battlegrounds, and this isn't even the first port to have done this. But you won't have heard much, if anything at all, about the dockworker stands against Israel happening around the Med and elsewhere, of which this is just the latest example. Netanyahu may be counting on Western governments to keep his war machine running, but ordinary working class people who have to actually handle his munitions, well, they're increasingly refusing to. Right, so ordinary dock workers across the Med and around the world have been increasingly taking stands where their leaders aren't necessarily doing the same. The power of ordinary working class people being ably demonstrated here, therefore, which is likely why it's not gone reported in Western mainstream media. They'd hate you to get any ideas of your own, of course. But the latest example, the Piraeus refusal to unload Israeli military goods, sent a clear message. Greece's moral conscience does not reside in its parliament or its foreign ministry, and frankly, many of us would associate our own governments in that remark, wouldn't we? But in its ports, in its people, in other words. And it really is the power of ordinary people behind this. It was not an isolated protest, but the latest in a series of actions by ENEDEP, the Port of Piraeus Container Handling Workers Union. Yes, a trade union, folks, which had already blocked ammunition shipments to Israel in October of last year as well. These actions, coordinated with pro-Palestinian activist networks and rooted in a tradition of militant Greek labour politics, are part of a broader trend of port blockades against Israel from Genoa to Durban. But let's start with the Greek government, because protests happen when people disagree with them, don't they? And this was a protest at the end of the day, wasn't it? Greece's alignment with Israel did not happen by accident. Over the last decade, certainly, Athens has shifted its stance towards a deepening strategic partnership with Tel Aviv. And this has been based on a combination of things like security, energy, and diplomatic calculations, but it sits uneasily with the Greek public, who are not so far away from Israel and Palestine in the grand scheme of things, are they? Everything happening there is a bit close to home, and has now provoked outright defiance from the country's workers. The turning point here was Greece's growing regional rivalry with Turkey. As tensions have escalated over maritime boundaries and gas exploration rights in the eastern Mediterranean, Israel became a natural partner for Athens. Netanyahu's government, hostile to Ankara publicly, even as Turkey supplied Israel with oil, of course, it's all a bit two-faced really, and equipped with advanced military technology, offered both diplomatic support and access to arms. This culminated in April of 2021 when Greece signed its largest ever defence agreement, a $1.68 billion deal with Israeli defence giant Elbit Systems to build and operate a Hellenic Air Force training centre. Haaretz described this as a historic deepening of military ties, while the Times of Israel hailed it as evidence that Greece and Israel were becoming strategic allies. The deal was only one of many. Greece has since purchased Israeli drones, conducted joint air force exercises, allowed Israeli military and surveillance aircraft to use its airspace. At the time, Greece has pursued energy cooperation with Israel through projects like the East Med pipeline, which promises to link Israeli and Cypriot gas fields to European markets via Greece. For Mitsotakis, these ties serve a dual purpose. They strengthen Greece's claim as a regional energy hub and cement its reputation as a reliable NATO-aligned state, reassuring both Washington and Brussels. Yet, this has still come at a cost, political cost. Greek public opinion remains firmly pro-Palestinian, shaped by a history of anti-imperialist struggle and Orthodox Christian solidarity with the Holy Land. Polling consistently shows that a majority of Greeks oppose military cooperation with Israel, and mass protests in Athens and Thessaloniki have condemned the war on Gaza. Mitsotakis' diplomatic balancing act, publicly expressing concern for Palestinian civilians while facilitating Israeli military operations, rings hollow in this context, therefore. So the dock workers' defiance at Piraeus has brought this contradiction into sharp relief now. The government's options versus its people here are rather limited. Mitsotakis could, in theory, invoke emergency labour laws to force Enedet back to work, but doing so would risk further political backlash. The Greek people are not only sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, but deeply supportive of their dock workers. We're all broadly familiar with Greece, I hope, but how much coastline it has. It has rather a lot. Its reliance on sea trade would be fairly obvious to most people, I would imagine. You can imagine the Greek people are respectful of their dock workers, can't you? But not only that, their current militancy versus Israeli military deliveries is tied to a broader tradition of working class resistance there. Cracking down on them would risk sparking protests far beyond the port. So as much as this hurts Israel, it's shaming their government too. The refusal to unload Israeli-bound cargo at Piraeus is not a spontaneous outburst of solidarity, though, but the result of deliberate organisation and that long history of militant trade unionism. Enedet occupies a uniquely strategic position in global supply chains, and its actions are informed by both moral conviction and a tradition of industrial militancy. Piraeus is one of the busiest container ports in the Mediterranean, handling millions of tons of cargo annually, and serving as a critical transshipment hub for goods moving from Asia to Europe. Much of Israel's imported industrial raw materials, particularly those sourced from India and China, pass through Piraeus before being reloaded onto vessels bound for Haifa or Ashdod. By blocking these shipments, Enedet is targeting a key logistical artery for Israel's military-industrial complex, therefore. The union itself is unusually powerful by European standards as well in and of itself. And again, this all plays into Greece's reliance on sea trade, that they become so powerful. Enedet is closely aligned with the Communist Party of Greece, the KKE, and its militant trade union federation, the PAME, both of which have long histories of anti-imperialist activism. Greek unions have staged dozens of general strikes over the last 2 decades, many of them linked to opposition to NATO interventions or neoliberal austerity policies imposed by the EU. This tradition of political trade unionism gives Enedet both organisational capacity and public legitimacy. Its record of successful confrontations with COSCO, for example, the Chinese state-owned company that operates Piraeus, demonstrates its strength. Despite COSCO's reputation for union suppression, Enedet has won concessions on wages and safety conditions through strikes and port blockades. Now this experience is being channeled into an explicitly political cause against both their own government and Israel over Palestine. So with all that background, what have they actually done now then, Damo? Well, Enedet refused to unload 5 ships carrying military-grade steel for Israeli arms manufacturers, including the Ever Golden and COSCO's shipping Pisces. We will not allow the port to become a logistics hub for the transfer of war equipment, the union has declared. Our goal is to physically prevent the unloading. And this was not their first action either. In October of last year, Enedet blocked ammunition shipments to Israel, a protest not widely reported, but was picked up by Reuters. These actions are part of a sustained campaign rather than isolated acts of resistance, therefore. The blockades have been supported by a coalition of activist groups. BDS Greece have coordinated with Enedet to track shipments and publicise arrival schedules. Protesters have formed human chains outside port facilities, while the KKE have mobilised solidarity demonstrations. This alliance between organised labour and grassroots activism has amplified the protest's impact, turning them into a national and international symbol of resistance, at least amongst those who will have heard about it, that is. The Greek dock workers are part of a growing international trend in which workers use their control over strategic infrastructure to resist state violence, and especially when that state isn't necessarily their own, but Israel. Ports, which were once seen as politically neutral spaces, are increasingly becoming battlegrounds of conscience. Italy has actually been at the forefront of this movement. The Collettivo Autonomo Lavoratori Portuali, CALP, I'm glad I don't have to say that again, based in Genoa, refused to load arms shipments bound for Israel back in May 2021, explicitly citing solidarity with Gaza. CALP workers later coordinated with French unions to block weapons containers just last month as well. Spanish dock workers in Barcelona have declared they will not handle Israeli arms shipments, and of course their government has backed that up as well. And Belgium's BTB union has called for an arms embargo too. Beyond Europe, South Africa's SATAWU has refused to unload Israeli ships since at least 2009. Framing its actions as part of the broader struggle against global apartheid and drawing direct parallels, of course, between Israel and South Africa's former regime. In the United States, community activists in Oakland successfully pressured ILWU dock workers to delay unloading an Israeli Zimlines vessel during the 2021 Block the Boat campaign. What makes these actions significant is not just their immediate impact, but their potential for coordination. International federations such as the International Transport Workers Federation, the ITF, already provide a framework for cross-border solidarity. If unions in Greece, in Italy, in Spain and France coordinated even a month-long blockade, Israel's military supply chains could be seriously disrupted. Could they even get munitions through the Med at that point? The alternative, of course, is the Red Sea, and, well, the Houthis would have a field day there, wouldn't they? Ordinary people, if they coordinate in this way, could really do some damage to the Israeli war machine, as reliant on sea trade arguably as Greece is, really. These actions are also reshaping the global BDS movement. While consumer boycotts target Israeli products largely symbolically, dockworker blockades strike directly at Israel's logistical lifelines. They are harder to ignore, harder to suppress without provoking public backlash, and carry enormous symbolic weight too. Israel can reroute cargo through other ports all it likes, or try to, but the practical and symbolic consequences of these blockades are significant. Piraeus is a major transshipment hub for Asian goods, and rerouting shipments increases costs, delays production schedules, and complicates logistics for Israel's arms industry. Military-grade steel and other specialized materials operate on tight supply chains. Even short disruptions can have cascading effects. The greater threat, however, is political. The image of ordinary workers refusing to handle Israeli war cargo undermines Netanyahu's narrative of legitimacy. It paints his government as dependent on global complicity, which it is, and highlights the moral failure of allied governments, which are all true. It also destroys the propaganda Israel is still sowing, their Hasbara, because unified port blockades of their military materials blow all of that out of the water. Again, it's why this story has gone grossly underreported. Israel has long relied on the assumption that global trade networks are apolitical, but the port blockades challenge this assumption directly. If these actions spread, they could create a significant public relations crisis for Israel, forcing it to divert resources into lobbying and diplomatic pressure rather than focusing solely on its military objectives. The Piraeus blockade highlights a profound moral divide. Governments like Greece's justify their support for Israel in terms of security, energy, and regional stability. Workers act on solidarity and conscience. So this is not just a political disagreement, it represents a clash between two fundamentally different visions of international politics. In Greece, this contrast is especially stark. Mitsotakis speaks of humanitarian concern while signing multi-billion-dollar defense deals with Israel. NADEP's actions expose the duplicity, positioning dockworkers as the true representatives of Greece's moral conscience. In refusing to handle military cargo, they embody an ethical stance that too many governments lack the courage or are too bought and paid for to adopt. This then raises a larger question, therefore. Are workers becoming the real moral actors in global politics? Is it the working class? In an era when governments are increasingly beholden to strategic alliances and corporate interests, grassroots labour movements may be the only forces willing to act on principle. The media portrayal of these actions is also telling. While alternative outlets like Squawk Box celebrate the dock workers as heroes, rightly so in my view, mainstream media have chosen to bury the story completely and not cover it at all, keeping us uninformed to preserve a specific narrative. This battle over narrative reflects a broader struggle over who gets to define legitimacy in international politics, and the fact more and more people are understandably turning to alternative media to be fully informed and not selectively so in line with vested interests. The Piraeus blockade is more than a labour dispute, therefore. It's a direct confrontation between moral conviction and political expediency that carries weight, and a message that goes beyond just a dockyard and the unloading or refusal to of certain goods. Workers, not governments, are taking meaningful action against a war that many Western states still tacitly support. If similar actions spread across the Mediterranean, and beyond by all means, Israel could face not just logistical delays, but a crisis of legitimacy as ordinary workers challenge the systems that enable its war machine. The future of this movement depends on whether it can scale up. A coordinated month-long blockade, as I said earlier, by unions in Greece or Italy or Spain could significantly disrupt Israel's supply chains and embolden similar actions elsewhere. Israel's supply routes are incredibly vulnerable to such a coordinated action. They are utterly reliant on the Mediterranean at this point in time. Ports have the potential to become the front line in a new battleground of conscience, because if dock workers can refuse complicity, what excuse do governments have? More broadly, some governments are taking appropriate action, though, as a 6-point plan of action to now be implemented has just been agreed in Colombia off the back of the first major meeting of the Hague group of Global South nations that is now set to inflict more hardship on Israel, not least in that logistics department too, but also in the courtroom as that happens. So get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping support the channel at the very same time, which is very much appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.